Hey guys, welcome to another video. My name is Ian. I hope that you're having a wonderful day today. In this video, I wanted to review a brand new release for you all, that being called The Fourth Consort. This is by Edward Ashton and it is out today. I'm very excited to talk to you guys about this new sci-fi release. So the reason that I was drawn to this, aside from the gorgeous cover, which I think just really is magnificent. I love the colors. I love the huge cityscape in the distance and how that makes you feel curious about what's going on, and the planet looks kind of interesting. It just totally works for me. But the cover aside, what drew me to this book is the author, Edward Ashton, who is the author of Mickey 7, which if you don't know is being adapted into a movie in March. But the movie's called Mickey 17, and I'm so excited for this movie. It's one of my most anticipated releases of the year because it's directed by Bong Joon-ho, who directed one of my favorite movies, Parasite. All that aside, though, I was very drawn to this book for those two reasons, as well as the plot of this book. And so I requested from NetGalley, got the audiobook, and promptly forgot that I had it until Sunday night. And so I thought to myself, you know what? This isn't that long. Maybe I'll see if I can get into it and listen to all of it before release date so that I can get a review filmed and put out on the date of release. And boy, oh boy, did this book fly by. How I'm going to be discussing this book is by breaking it down into 5 different segments, those being plot, pace, character, immersion, prose, and then I'll just talk about my general enjoyment of it. So really 6 segments, but 5 ones about the book specifically, and the last one more about my experience of it. That's how I've been rating books in my book journal this year, and it just works out really well for me. So we're going to go ahead and do that in video format and see how it works. Let's jump in. First, let's go ahead and jump into the plot of The Fourth Consort. So in this book, we follow Dalton Greaves and his companion Mira secondarily, but really Dalton is the main character. Dalton and Mira work for the Unity, which is an intergalactic group of people who are trying to form this confederation of all of the different species across the galaxy and try to establish a peaceful core and a way for all of those beings to interact safely and harmoniously rather than causing, warfare across the universe and destroying everything and blah, 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 blah. Essentially, Dalton and Mira are representatives who are sent from planet to planet to establish first contact with these different species and try to broach that peaceful agreement with them. But things don't always go according to plan. At the very start of this book, we jump immediately in. The very first sentence is something that an alien species is saying to Dalton, and it's their conversation as they have this first contact with each other, and things go from there. Unfortunately, a lot of stuff happens very quickly at the very beginning of this book, and Dalton is left abandoned, as is Mira, on this planet with these different species, these different beings, and they have to basically fend for themselves and try to establish this peaceful relationship with these people in a very hostile environment where they are completely isolated from all of their support. They have their little ship, but they don't have their big ship, and they don't have any backup. Additionally, there is another alien species that has tried to establish contact with this home species, and the two, Dalton and Mira and this other species, are vying for the loyalty and the partnership with this home species. So there's a lot going on in this book, but it's surprising at how easy it was to get into it. But we'll talk about that in a minute. One thing that I really loved about this story and the plot specifically was that there is very clearly this very large world that has been established. There's a lot going on as far as the politics and the technology. We're in the future. There is space travel, and it's more common than we could ever have imagined. And there are all of these different alien species out there amongst the stars that we now know about. And there is obviously a lot of history that goes into that. But we have just an 8.5-hour audiobook to get our story out there, and the author doesn't waste any time giving unnecessary details, which could be a bad thing and could be a good thing. For me personally, while there were the moments where I wished that I got a little bit more of the world, this is a small story told within this larger world, and I can definitely respect that. Even though this is a standalone, and part of me wonders if this author is going to write more books in this world, if this book is successful, I can accept that this story isn't really about how everything got to being where it is. It's more, okay, this is where we are. Now let's tell the story. Let's get down to the plot. And that's exactly what this book does. And I think it does it really well. I thought that the plot was very compelling. I found all of the different obstacles that Dalton is forced to go through to be sometimes ridiculous and hilarious, and at other times terrifying and daunting. And I thought that those two emotions were balanced very well. There were moments when I was on the edge of my seat, followed very quickly by moments where I was chuckling to myself, and I thought that that was excellently done by Edward Ashton. It was really quite a compelling read in that regard. I don't really want to spoil where this story goes, other than to tell you that this is very much a fish out of water type story. Dalton is forced into close proximity with these different alien species, and he has to really find his way in some very challenging social situations, partly because he's not fully, aware of their customs and their abilities and all that jazz, but additionally, he has a translator gadget that translates their language, but the problem is that there are some words that don't translate, and so the translator will make some educated guesses, but ultimately there's not a whole lot of validity to that because they don't have any words to go off of, and that added obstacle gets Dalton into some very messy situations, and I found that extremely compelling. Anytime there was a word or a situation where the translator couldn't really help to provide the necessary context, I was on the edge of my seat wondering, is Dalton going to get through the situation intact? What's going to happen? And I found that very, very compelling. That's all I'm going to say about the plot because I do want to keep this non-spoilery. So as far as plot goes, I'm rating this on a scale of 1 to 15 for plot, and on the plot scale, I give this a 12 out of 15. Moving on to pace, this is, like I said, an 8.5 hour long audiobook. So it is not long, and the author had a lot of ground to cover in regard to the things that were possible, the things that were discovered, the things that were undiscovered, and laying the groundwork for where the story was going to go. And ultimately, I felt that this book did not suffer from having to give me too much information. I thought that the author did an incredible job of balancing that delivery of the exposition with carrying the plot forward. Not at any point in this book did I feel bogged down. It took me maybe a chapter to get into what was going on just because this book immediately throws you into an interaction with an alien, and so I had to get my bearing there. But as soon as that starts and I got fully immersed in the world in that first chapter, I fully was on board with it. I thought the plot flew by, so much happened, and I wanted even more, but never was I bored in this book. It kept the pace going, it kept the exposition very digestible, and I found the overall plot to continue to move at the pace I wanted it to. Never did it feel like there was a dull moment, even though there were some quieter moments that I could truly appreciate as well. Especially towards the end of the book, there were some really fantastic character interactions that I think were masterfully done in a way that was compelling due to the circumstances that the characters are in, and the differences in the ways that they communicate and their feelings and their cultures and everything going on there. There's all of this background that plays into the plot that keeps the conversations that might normally be a little bit on the slower side very, very engaging, and I really enjoyed that. Overall, for pace, I give this book a 15 out of 15. I think that it is masterfully done, and there was not a single moment where I wished the pace was different, either slower or faster. I really enjoyed it. Next, let's talk about characters. So there are not too many characters in this book, but there are very diverse characters in that we only have 2 human characters in this book. The rest are alien species of different kinds. There are 2 different alien species that we are interacting with in this story, and I absolutely loved that aspect of the story. I thought that Edward Ashton's creativity was truly flowing in those moments where we got the physical descriptions of these alien creatures. I could very easily picture them because they were described using terms and things that I could relate to, but in a way that was unexpected and really engaged my imagination in a really fun way. Additionally, on top of being physically different from the human beings, they also have so many different things going on as far as their customs and their cultures and their education and their technology and so much stuff. It was constantly an experience and discovery of me with the main character Dalton figuring out, okay, what do these people know? What do they not know? What are they going to understand in regard to the human side of things? And how messy is this going to get? I love that there was so much consistency with the characters because we get the human characters, but all of the other characters, the alien ones, very clearly have a different background, and it's fully displayed here, fully consistent, and I found it to be extremely well done. I had such a blast getting to discover more about these characters, and a lot of them also had such complexity. One character in particular who starts out as an antagonist but sort of becomes a hesitant ally at times was an incredibly fascinating character. I just loved the execution of this character and finding out more and more about him. I think that he was really engaging, and he added something to the plot that would not have been there if it was just the main character and this one species. I think that having that extra element and that extra perspective on the universe and the creatures that are out there was really necessary and really impactful on the story. I really loved it. I also really enjoyed Dalton as a character. He is intelligent and he is experienced, but at the same time, he is struggling a little bit to find his place. He kind of gets dragged into the Unity and this job because he's down in life and he doesn't really have anybody that he is connected to on Earth. He gets this job offer and he decides to take it. And it's ultimately a decision that may have not been a good one for him, but he really has to find himself throughout this story and discover what really matters to him. And while there is so much stuff that he's invested in his life, whether or not those things carry more weight than the things that emotionally matter to him. And I loved his journey in this story as well. And I thought that Mira was a very good foil to him in regard to the motivations and them being in similar situations but having very, very different reactions to the things that are going on. I found them to be really engaging. I liked their dynamic. Yeah, it was all really well done. I enjoyed the characters a lot. So as far as characters go, I gave this a 13 out of 15. I would have liked to see a little bit more from the home species that we are experiencing. While there were some good character moments from one character in particular, there were others that I wasn't as crazy about or I wanted a little bit more from. So overall, not a perfect score, but a 13 out of 15, not bad at all. Next, let's go ahead and talk about Immersion. So this story is a very vast one in that there is so much going on in this world. We get exposure to 2 different alien species. We spend the entirety of this story on an alien planet in a society that we know nothing about at the start of the story. And I think that the society itself and the culture and kind of the social structure was really well executed. I think we get a very clear picture of the different social statuses, kind of the tiers, I guess, to it, as well as the different roles that different genders play, and a peek into society from the perspective of this character who is in a very dire situation. We get his perspective, so we don't see the fullness of it, but we see enough to feel immersed in the world, to understand how different it is from our own, and to really be engaged by the story itself. That being said, I don't feel like this book had quite enough descriptions of the environment itself. We're on this alien planet. We have these different species, and I really enjoyed getting that side of the immersion. But the world itself, as beautiful as the cover to this book is, that is the most descriptive thing about this book in some ways. I don't necessarily feel like I got a full picture of the world itself, and I would have liked a little bit more from it in that regard. If I had just more descriptions of the landscape or the environment or the weather even, like as small as those details are, and while it may have ultimately impacted the pacing slightly, I think it would have helped me to be slightly more immersed in the story. That being said, this kind of goes hand in hand with pacing, and I feel like the pace and the plot and the world itself, as far as like the characters and the society and all that, were engaging enough that this didn't really bother me necessarily in the moment. But looking back on the story, I can't necessarily physically place a lot of scenes in a specific environment, and I wish that I could, and I think it would help me to remember things a little bit more fondly as far as the specifics of where things are taking place and all that jazz. That being said, I think that the world itself, aside from the physical world, but the culture and society are really well done, and it never feels like we're on Earth. It feels like we are in this situation with these people entirely. And so I do think that was well done, and overall I gave Immersion a 12 out of 15. Next up, let's go ahead and talk prose. So I typically lump prose and themes together in my discussion, or like my inner thoughts. Not that I've really talked about this in a review format before, but prose and themes kind of go hand in hand for me. And this book isn't necessarily heavy on the beautiful prose. Like I said, there's not a whole lot of vivid descriptions of the world. I do think that the creatures or the different species were very well described, but the world itself isn't necessarily very vivid. And in addition to that, there are some really powerful themes here about humanity and the goodness in people versus selfishness and the darkness and the tendency towards, I guess, self-preservation. in this story, but ultimately I don't think that those themes were touched on heavily enough to be necessarily impactful, and I don't necessarily know that that was the author's intent, to leave a huge lasting impact as much as it was an exploration and creativity in regard to these different species and how they interact. I do feel like I took some things away from this story, but ultimately the prose and the themes were not the strongest component of this book by any means. It was more the plot and the pacing and the characters. Those were the strongest things for me. So overall, for prose and themes, I give this an 11 out of 15. And finally, the sixth category we come to is personal enjoyment. So the thing with this one is I do give this the most weight in my scoring, because ultimately, I think that you can read a book and recognize its qualities, you know, on one hand, but at the same time, if you don't emotionally connect with it and really enjoy your time with it, I think as far as like fiction goes specifically, I don't think that I personally can give a book a 5-star. Even if like all the other scores are super high, perfect, if I didn't enjoy myself reading it or have a connection to it, you know, it's not necessarily like, oh, I had a happy time reading this, but did I connect to this book? And that's really what I'm wondering here. And overall, I think that this is a story that really clicked with me just because it doesn't waste any time, and it immediately puts you into the heart of the conflict as well as the heart of the world and the different characters that we're going to be interacting with. And I really enjoyed that, and this book was well executed enough that I felt immediately hooked by it, and I never lost that feeling. I was able to read this very, very quickly because I was enjoying myself so much. I think that this is really creative. It makes me very curious about what else this author has written and is going to write, because he does some things in this book that I think a lot of authors wouldn't have, you know, just taking into account the fact that there's this big world and there is a big story that could be told here, but that's not the story that he wants to tell. He wants to set the big world up, make it just present enough that you kind of have footing in the world, and then tell the story he wants to tell. And I think that there's a boldness to that, and a certain level of creativity in that, where he doesn't waste time getting into the things that other authors might. He knows the story he's going to tell, and he tells it. And I think that was very well done. I had such a good time with these characters. I had such a good time discovering so much about this society. And ultimately, the plot itself took some turns that I didn't expect. And I really, really enjoyed that. So overall, I gave this a 19 out of 25, which may feel a little bit low, but because it's so high as far as like the number itself with 25, a 19 is not bad by any means. So if you've been counting along at home, that gives the Fourth Consort by Edward Ashton a total of 82 out of 100, which means that this book gets roughly a 4-star rating for me, and I feel like that is absolutely earned. This is a book that I greatly enjoyed and I highly recommend. Like I said, this book is out now. It is published by St. Martin's Press, so thank you so much to the publisher for giving me access to the audio copy of this book. I think it's also very well narrated, so if you're into audiobooks, definitely check this out. I had such a blast with it, and I will definitely be reading more by Edward Ashton, including Mickey 7, hopefully in the next month or so that I can read it before I see the movie. But is this a book that sounds interesting to you? I certainly hope so, because I've done my best to convince you to read it, and I hope you do. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you're planning on picking this book up, or if you've already read it, let me know what you think of it. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.